Thank you for watching us again. My guest today is a Senator, Mary Kunesh. She is an American politician and a member of the Minnesota State Senate. She is deeply involved in work to advance broader progressive agenda, racial and gender equity, clean water and air, broadly shared prosperity. As a senator, she leads in rebuilding economy, restoring health, building a public safety practice that works. She is also an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. She's a lot more that can fit in this introduction, but I have to say I'm very happy to have her as my guest. You were born as a middle child in a family of 13 kids. What are the good lessons that you learned in such an environment and that were useful to you later in your political career?
Well, I would say for sure the fact that there were so many of us that we had to learn early the value of working together and kind of that collective effort for the good of us all. We knew that if we helped each other, if we worked together, got our chores done, looked out for each other, we'd have more time for playing with our friends, doing good things, kept my mom in a good mood. And so we really learned that lesson early about the collective good for all.
25 years ago, you were a single mother of three who often must do three jobs. I think that's amazing. You attended college on the weekends to earn your teacher's degree. But at one point, however, something changed. Can you tell me what?
Sure. So I was a single mom in my early 30s. I had three great kids. I was actually supporting myself by doing family daycare in my home. I was working as a server, a waitress in one restaurant and at a library in another place just to make ends meet. But I was going to school on the weekends to get my teaching degree, and at the end of your teaching experience, or as a student, you have to do student teaching. So that starts at the end of August all the way through to December. And during that time, because I was a full-time student teacher, not earning any income, I had to have enough money saved up to pay my mortgage and feed my kids and whatnot. Well, unfortunately, I did get my degree that December, but by January, the government had gone onto a shutdown and I wasn't able to apply for my teaching license. I had a job all lined up. And I had saved just enough money to get me through those months. And all of a sudden I had like $30 in my account and I had to pay my mortgage and feed my kids and all of those things. So I remembered a discussion with my dad. My dad was a lawyer and very social conscious. And there's always been sort of a negative connotation about receiving welfare, or that title or that phrase, welfare mom. The picture comes up of a mom having a bajillion kids, living on the money of the taxpayers. But I remember my dad saying that those funds are there to support, to help families and people who are in a crisis. And those are the resources that we shouldn't be ashamed to ask for and accept, because it gives you that boost in a time of trouble. And so I swallowed my pride, went and applied for assistance. And really and truly, if it hadn't been for those safety nets, the dollars and the food stamps and the assistance that I received back in those days, I don't know that I would have been able to keep my house or, have been able to take care of my children as well. And so with that lesson of how important it is to ensure we have those safety nets ready for those in a struggle, that has really helped me as a state legislator to expound on those experiences.
You are strong and intensely engaged advocate for gender equality. If you compare the position of women in society from, let's say, 2016 in your first term and today, what has changed? Do you see some changes?
I do see changes. I think one of the big changes is that we have more women in our state legislature, being elected to office every cycle that there is an election. And these women are skilled, intelligent, verbal, fearless women who aren't afraid to stand up and speak their truth and share their experiences, so that when we are creating legislation, we understand that they speak what they know, they speak their knowledge. And as well as the men that are elected. Now I'm a Democrat, I'm a DFL Minnesotan, Democrat, Farmer, Labor. That's our political party here in Minnesota for Democrats. But we also have just some incredible champions for women's right and human right and environmental rights coming in from the men that are being elected. And so there's sort of a little bit of a turnover at our legislature with new legislators, new elected, combined with our seasoned politicians who I value incredibly. We don't have term limits here in Minnesota for those elected positions, but I have found those that have been here for a while to be valuable resources. They have that historic knowledge of past legislation and past issues and relationships that are really helpful. So in essence, I feel like on my side of the aisle, and it's starting to churn up and turn over, but in a good way, as we recognize the skills and the value that each person brings to the legislature.
Your first term happened, as I mentioned earlier, in 2016. I believe you were very happy about such an opportunity, but how challenging was it to get your first term just then, given the new president and the changes that have taken place?
Yeah, that certainly was a bittersweet election for us, but I am fortunate to live in a district that has a strong Democrat population with progressive values. So while it was not so difficult for me to get elected that time, it certainly was a challenge when I entered the legislature because we were in the minority in the House. And so while I was trying to learn and start working on legislation, I really had to come to the understanding very quickly that whatever side of the aisle you are on, who's ever in the majority or minority, certainly does make a huge difference whether you can get your legislation moving or not. But it also made me have to learn or use all the relationship skills or negotiation skills that I might have had or I'm learning on the fly in order to get the good legislation passed that I was able to.
Was that biggest lesson from your first term? Would you say that?
My biggest lesson is absolutely to create those relationships with people on the other side of the aisle if you really do want to make the difference. Because if I just sat and said, well, they're not going to listen to me, they're not going to hear my bill, they're not going to work with me, they don't know me, they don't know my story, they don't know the constituents that I represent. And so it's really important, information is power. If I give them the information that they need, we hope that they will jump in and support it. That doesn't really always happen, but it has happened a few times when it's been really, really important. And for that, I'm really appreciative.
One of for me, the most important question is what are the challenges that a woman politician in the USA today needs to be prepared to face?
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is for the opposite party to take you seriously. I think there still is a stigma of women as not being knowledgeable or to be taken seriously, or that they understand the issues at hand in the day. And I believe that, you know, because of that, that's why so much of this relationship building is so important. I do a lot of legislation that is making an attempt to right the wrongs of our Indigenous people, our Native Americans here in Minnesota. And I have found that so many people, you know, in my own party, as well as throughout the legislature, just have not the familiarity or the understanding of the historic trauma of our Native American people. So one of the things that I find constantly challenged is educating people around, you know, the fact that the lands were stolen and all our folks were herded onto pieces of land that were not sustainable, expected to all of a sudden change their lives, lost hundreds and hundreds and thousands of their family members. Their children were forced into boarding school. Native women experience highest levels of violence and are murdered than any other population. This is all news to so many people. And so one of my biggest challenges is to bring that to their attention in a way that they can digest, and then, you know, recognize that it's one thing if you don't know that information, if you aren't familiar with that history from the United States, but now that you know, it's your responsibility to make that positive change. And that is happening slowly.
Can you tell me, during the preparation for our interview, I read a lot about missing and murdered Indigenous women task force. But for the people who don't know what it's about, can you tell me more about this task force, and why is it such important to have this kind of office task force, and to speak publicly about these problems and issues?
Well, thanks for asking about that, because that has been one of my focuses from my very first year as a legislator in the House. I had heard about the report, the Canadian national study on their missing and murdered Indigenous women. And, you know, hearing stories from my family, from so many families about women, Native women that are victims of violence, even to today, who have gone missing and never been found, and very little has gone towards finding them or finding out what happened. And then, of course, highest levels of murder in Indigenous women. Here in Minnesota, even though American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state's population, between the 8 years of 2010 to 2018, 8% of all the murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And that was a data point that we got as a result of our task force. When I started to introduce this issue and the law, people would ask for data, and we just didn't have it because nobody was collecting it. It was like it wasn't that important to collect information about where and when and how many and under what circumstances our women have gone missing or are murdered. And finally, we were able to start to collect that data because, as we know, data really drives actions and decisions. You know, between the years of 2012 to 2020, anywhere between 27 and 54 American Indian women or girls in Minnesota went missing in any given month of those 8 years. And so those were really startling statistics that we've been able to share with our with the community, with the legislature. And so once I had heard this report out of Canada, I thought, you know, why isn't Minnesota doing anything about this generational historic trauma that our Native communities have experienced for so long? And I myself needed a lot of education around that. So I reached out to the Native community, specifically women and agencies that are already working on violence against women, and asked them to help me craft this legislation. So I was able to put together sort of a preliminary bill, and then invited them in to ask for, first of all, for their permission to do this, because this is extremely re-traumatizing for many. And then with their support, who would they like to see on this task force? Who were the people that they felt really needed to be in on this in order to do it with real intent and fidelity? And then what were the outcomes that they wanted from a task force? And so with the help of a couple dozen Native folks, we were able to put together the task force. And that task force really came down to, first of all, we needed to examine the systemic causes that behind the violence against Indigenous women and girls. And then we needed to find a way. We needed to examine and find appropriate methods for tracking and collecting that data so that we could share it. Not with just the general public, but between the systems within our government, so that they were talking to each other, so that public safety and our judges and our coroner all were getting the same information and able to understand, and I call it a pandemic, the pandemic of MMIW. And then, of course, we need to report those findings, because at the end of the day, we want to make systemic changes in policies and the institutions like policing and child welfare and the coroner practice and in other governmental areas. So it was so important that we were able to come together and do this. And then, when people say, well, what do you want at the end of this task force? Really and truly, we want to create processes and measures to help the victims, to help the victim families and the communities. And of course, at the end of the day, we want to put in place ways to prevent and heal from this violence that has just plagued our Indigenous communities for centuries and generations.
It seems to me that learning and education have never been more important, and educators, unfortunately, in the whole world have never been more underestimated. You are very active when it comes to the importance of education. You use your function and position to advance education, but why is this topic so important to you personally?
Well, as you mentioned, my family, my mother's family is from the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. And so I grew up hearing, wonderful stories about my family and the life out on the prairies of South Dakota. But I also heard and saw the actual reality of our Native communities, and especially here in Minnesota. I grew up about 80 miles north of the metropolitan area in a small town. But my dad was a lawyer, and he was like a county attorney and city attorney, but he also recognized his responsibility to help our Native communities as well. And so he would take us to the reservations when he was doing his pro bono work, and we saw the deplorable condition of the housing, the lack of infrastructure like plumbing and drinkable water, the schools that the federal government had promised to educate those children in was in terrible disrepair, under-resourced. It felt, as a child, I could tell there was some injustice happening right here and right now. And of course, education often is the biggest equalizer. Education, knowledge is power. And as an educator myself, I've come to realize that. One of the big things that that I was able to do as a state legislature was to ensure that we had equitable funding for, we have 4 BIE schools in Minnesota. Those are Bureau of Indian Education schools. Those are schools that the federal government is supposed to support financially and in every way. It's part of the treaties, the federal treaties. But of course, they have never really funded those schools the way they should have, with integrity and with fidelity. And so there was some extra funding that was going to those schools to at least bring them up to the level of all the other public school kids in Minnesota. But we had to go back every 2 years and ask for that money. And it was always, you know, like always with the natives, we have to ask for what we are supposed to be getting. We shouldn't have to always ask for it. It should be done without that effort. And so I was able to get that funding and make it permanent so that those schools can thrive like every other school in our state. And it's an important lesson, because while we have we do have a few other Native American women in our state legislature who are championing and challenging all the work that we're doing. When I was elected, Jamie Becker Finn came into office. She's Native Anishinaabe. We have a newer member, Heather Keeler. We have our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, and the woman who I aspired to join at the legislature, Susan Allen. She was the first Native American woman to be in the legislature. We all sort of have our niches, our areas that we are championing, especially for our Native communities. And I don't know that if we weren't in those places that these things would be happening. And so when we talk about education, it's not just education for our children, but education for our decision makers in our state, so that they understand the consequences of generations and the history of under-resourcing and lack of acknowledgement for the treaties and the sovereignty of our Native tribes. And so I'm hoping that as a perpetual learner myself, an educator, we will be able to bring that level of understanding into the decision makers, so that we do bring good change for all of our communities across Minnesota.
And for the end, what would be your advice for a woman who are considering running for the first time?
Please do. Please do. There are so many different support systems out there for women who would like to run for an office. And if you don't feel like, the legislature is your place just yet, there are many levels at, within your own communities, whether it's a school board or on your city council or a commission within your municipality. Build a support system with other like-minded women. And if you want to know how does this work, or what's the responsibility for that position, start supporting, volunteering for elected officials, and build that relationship with them, because that's what I did. I didn't know what to do, but I got involved. I listened, I learned, I built those relationships until not only was I ready to run, but I recognized an opportunity when it came. And then I had that base of support there for me. And so reach out to other women who are elected officials, or support women who are running, and just do it. Just step into that arena and get yourself ready. Even if you're not going to run, find ways to support other women who are running or who are in office.